So you filed an insurance claim and your carrier has offered to pay you $45,000 for the damages to your house after a storm. But your contractor just gave you an estimate for $90,000 to repair those same damages. You go back and forth with your insurance company for a couple months. You guys can't quite seem to agree on an amount. So then someone tells you, just invoke appraisal. And it sounds simple enough, right? But is it? Welcome back, I'm the insurance lady, and today we're going to talk all things appraisal, the good, the bad, and the cost. We'll talk about what works, what doesn't work, and how it can cost you thousands of dollars. So what is appraisal? Appraisal is a dispute resolution process that's written into the policy. And it's important to know that appraisal is not arbitration. Arbitration is a totally separate form of dispute resolution, and it has different implications. And appraisal is also not litigation. Litigation is when someone files a lawsuit and you have an attorney representing you. So what's the purpose of appraisal? Appraisal is the dispute resolution process that is used to resolve disputes for the amount of the loss. So when would appraisal be appropriate? Appraisal is appropriate whenever both parties, you and the insurance company, both agree that there are covered damages, and you guys just can't agree what those covered damages are worth. And an example would be if the insurance company prepares an estimate and they say that the lumber is going to cost $20,000 to purchase to do some interior framing. And your contractor says, actually, the cost of lumber has just skyrocketed and now it's going to cost me $40,000 to buy that same amount of lumber. So that's a great example of a pricing dispute that would be appropriate for appraisal. It's important to know that appraisal does not make coverage determinations. So it's not meant for coverage disputes. It's only meant for disputes pertaining to the amount of loss. And appraisal also won't determine if the damage if it occurred during your policy period as well. So also know that the exact rules could vary between states and also whatever is outlined in your policy language. An example would be in the policy language, the appraisal section will outline how many days you have to name your appraiser once either party invokes appraisal. And also another example would be North Carolina. North Carolina is a pricing only state. And so if your property is in North Carolina and your claim goes to appraisal, then the appraisers are only going to be able to establish the value of the items that have already been estimated by the carrier. So that award estimate is not going to have any additional line items in there. It's only going to have the line items that were already estimated by the carrier, but the appraisers will come to an agreement as to what each of those line items is valued at. So how does it work? It's actually more straightforward than you would think. Whenever you and your insurance company can't decide on the value of the loss, either party can invoke appraisal if they wish. And it's a pretty straightforward process. You would just send a letter or an email saying, we disagree to the amount of loss that you've established and I wish to invoke appraisal. And from that point, both of you will name your appraisers, and then those appraisers will come together and they'll select an umpire. And the umpire's role is to settle the dispute that the appraisers may have. So if the appraisers can't come to an agreement on their own, then they would use the umpire's assistance to help reach an agreement. And the award is going to be whatever the decided agreement is. The award is considered executed when 2 out of 3 panelists sign the award. A panelist is either the appraisers or the umpire. So there's 2 appraisers and 1 umpire making 3 panelists. And an award is considered executed when 2 out of 3 sign it. But the date of execution is the date of the most recent signature. And from that point, the insurance company has a set number of days to pay the award based on the date of execution. And keep in mind, the award that's returned is still subject to policy coverage. So for example, if a roof replacement was included in your award, but your policy has a roof exclusion, the amount of the award that's been allocated for that roof replacement isn't going to be paid to you because there's actually no coverage for the roof. So any award is still subject to the policy coverages and terms and conditions. So let's explain the roles. There's the appraiser that you hire, the appraiser that the insurance company hires, and the umpire. And you might be wondering, how do I select an appraiser? Does it have to be someone who has a specific certification? And the answer is no. You can hire anyone to represent you in the appraisal process. But the only caveat is that they have to be a disinterested third party. And what that means is that they can't stand to gain anything based on the amount of the award. And that can be manifested in different ways. So one example would be your contractor cannot be your appraiser because they stand to gain financially if it's a higher award, because they're the ones doing the work, so they can charge more. Or say, for example, your appraiser, instead of charging you time and expense or a flat fee, if they're charging you a percentage of the award, that's not disinterested third party either, because that's a commission base, and a commission base obviously stands to gain more the higher the award is. So you need someone who doesn't stand to gain anything financially based on the value of the award. So regardless if the award is $0 or $1 million, they're making the same amount either way. And so that's how they're a financially disinterested third party. And the same goes for the insurance company. So they have to have a disinterested third party as well. They're not going to be able to have someone who adjusts claims for them or an employee of theirs be one of their appraisers, because that's not considered disinterested third party either. And the umpire will have to clear conflicts to make sure that they don't have any conflict of interest with anyone that's involved in the appraisal. And the appraisers they'll make sure that the umpire has cleared conflicts, so you don't need to worry about that. So let's talk about the pros and the cons. The pros are that it can be faster than litigation and it can be cheaper than litigation. But a side note is that sometimes it does take a long time. So if you think that, we'll touch on this later, but if you think that this is going to be a fast process, it's not always a fast process. It can be, but it can also take some time. Also, another pro is that experts decide the value. So with litigation, a jury would be deciding the value, but one benefit of having experts decide the value is they know what they're doing. They know how to identify damage. They also know the repair process that goes into repairing that damage. And so when a jury may look at something and say, oh, a simple remove and reset, but an expert might say, actually, you can't really remove and reset that. You need to remove and then tear out some additional materials, and then you can do the repairs. And so it is beneficial having experts involved because they know exactly what goes into the repair process. Often, appraisal also resolves claims. And so after an award is returned, a lot of times that's the end of the claim. It's resolved and everyone is pretty happy with the outcome. Appraisal can also reduce stress. And so a lot of people find that the claims process can be very stressful. And so having a structured process for resolving the claim can be really beneficial by reducing that stress. Now let's talk about the cons. The cons, it can cost money. And what exactly is it going to cost? You'll have to pay your appraiser, and you'll also have to pay half of the umpire fees in the event that the appraisers can agree and they invoke umpire. And this is in addition to your policy deductible. So whatever your policy deductible is, you still have to pay that out of pocket, and you have to pay the appraiser fees, your appraiser fees. And some people might be wondering how much to expect. It really does vary. There's no set rate that everyone charges. Every appraiser is going to charge differently. Sometimes they charge time and expense, which means an hourly rate, and then they just tell you how many hours they worked and the mileage, that sort of a thing. And then sometimes they charge a flat rate. Typically, I see anywhere from about $1,500 upwards to $3,000. So you can see there's a pretty big gap of what they might charge. But that could be about what they charge. And then umpire, same thing. That would be your out-of-pocket expense for the umpire, and then as well as the insurance company. So you can see that paying your policy deductible, and then in addition to that, potentially paying up to $6,000 just for on the fees alone. That's a pretty big expense. But also, if the appraisers have to hire an expert, say to review certain damages, then, or maybe opine or give their opinion on a repair process, then those expert fees are going to be paid by you and the carrier. And so obviously your appraisers aren't going to pay that out of pocket. And so that's going to be passed on to you. And I've seen expert fees go upwards of $5,000. And so that can also be a really high expense. And like I said, it's in addition to your policy deductible. So do bear that in mind. Also, you might not like the result, and challenging an award is very difficult. I've seen awards come in that favor the insurance company. I've seen awards come in that favor the policyholder, but I've also seen awards come in the middle. Appraisal is inherently a compromise. It's trying to reach an agreement. And so just know that it's not always going to swing your way. It's not always going to swing their way. Sometimes it's in the middle. And so sometimes you just may not like the result that you get. And so you just have to know going into it that it's not a sure thing that you're going to get exactly what you want. And also, coverage disputes that you have before appraisal will still remain after the award. As we said, the appraisal does not actually resolve coverage issues. It only resolves disputes to the amount of loss. So if you're disputing a coverage decision, if you've been denied and you feel like you shouldn't have been, appraisal is not the solution to get that particular dispute resolved. Also, choosing the wrong appraiser, that is something to bear in mind. Although there's not a set list that you have to pick someone from, you want to make sure that it's someone who knows what they're doing. They've got to be an expert in their field. They need to have experience. They need to know how to identify damage, how to estimate what the repairs are going to cost. And besides that, you need to make sure that they have the capacity to take you on. And I cannot stress this enough. And the reason is because I mentioned earlier that sometimes appraisals can take a long time. And this particular reason is why. I've seen appraisals last for longer than 6 months, upwards of a year. And you might be thinking, why on earth would it take that long? It must be the insurance company. Actually, it's because of the appraiser that the homeowner hires. So appraisal is kind of a small world. A lot of people, they all know each other, but we see a lot of frequent appraisers that represent a lot of people. And a lot of times what they'll do is these appraisers will just take on as much work as they can, and then they overbook themselves. And then what happens is that they get behind, they get buried in work, and they're just trying to play catch up. And so there's been times where we've been trying to chase down appraisers that are representing the insureds, and they're not responding for months. Like, it's crazy. You wouldn't even think that someone that you would hire would do that, but they do, because they're just trying to stack up a bunch of work. And then what can happen is they get behind. And so maybe whenever you're looking for an appraiser, you can ask them, what's your current workload? What's your typical turnaround time? Because you want to make sure that they have the capacity to take you on as an appraiser, and make sure that they're not overbooked. And lastly, another con is that it can delay payments. And a lot of people think, oh, if I do appraisal, I'll get a quick payment, it'll resolve it. But sometimes the appraisal process can delay that payment, and the reason is typically because of scheduling, because the appraisers are going to need to schedule an inspection. And then if they can't agree and then they invoke umpire, sometimes the umpire will want to inspect. Likewise, if they have to get an expert out there, that expert's going to have to inspect. So every time an inspection has to be scheduled, that takes time to coordinate with everyone's schedules, including yours. And so that can be a cause for a delay. Also, again, if your appraiser that you hired is non-responsive, then it's going to take even longer to schedule all of those appointments because they're not responding or they're overbooked. Like sometimes we've called appraisers and they've said, oh, my next availability isn't for 6 weeks or something. And so that right there means that your file isn't even going to get started for another 6 weeks. So do keep that in mind. And like I said, make sure that you do your due diligence and make sure that they're not overbooked. So you might be wondering, with all these cons, even though there's pros, why would you invoke appraisal? Well, appraisal is appropriate whenever negotiations have stalled between you and the insurance company. You both agree that there's covered damages, but you can't agree on the amount, and it's especially valuable whenever both estimates have been released. So if you've got an estimate from your contractor and your insurance company's released their estimate, because then you can provide it to the appraisers, and then they have kind of a starting point to go on, and then they can that can sometimes make it a little bit speedier. So what might give you cause for pause whenever it comes to invoking appraisal? And I would say if the dispute is over coverage, because as we've stated, Appraisal is not for coverage disputes. It's only to resolve disputes pertaining to the amount of loss. Another is if there's key evidence that's still being gathered in the investigation of the claim, then you would want to make sure that that all is finished before you invoke appraisal. Or if you have items, if the insurance company releases an estimate and say it doesn't include damage to your shed and you feel like the shed should have been included, that's not appropriate for an appraisal. That's what's called a supplement. So you would then submit your documentation pertaining to the shed to your adjuster and say, hey, I want to request a supplement. This wasn't in the estimate and I'd like it to be considered to be added. And then the insurance company would have an opportunity to adjust that portion of the claim. Now, if they come back and they put that shed in, but you feel like it's worth more than what they've established the value to be, then that would be a good example of when appraisal would be appropriate. Also, if you feel like if you just negotiate with them a little bit longer, you might be able to resolve the dispute, then I would say that's probably a good option because it's going to save you money and it's going to save you time and save you stress. So if you feel like if you just negotiate a little bit longer, you might reach a resolution, then I would definitely say that is a good option to consider. Most of all, just make sure that you understand your policy, make sure you understand the appraisal conditions, make sure you understand all the rules that go with appraisal. And if you have a question about your particular claim, then I always suggest seek professional advice where appropriate. So just as some final takeaways about appraisal, because it can be a very handy tool to have and to use in effort to resolve a claim, is that appraisal, again, is not litigation and it's not arbitration. It's also not a magic solution. You invoke appraisal and all of a sudden, 1 week later, you get everything that you asked for. It's not going to be that magic solution, but it is an effective solution when used appropriately. So I hope that this video has given you some good tips and some knowledge about appraisal, and I hope you can better understand that process. So if you enjoyed learning a little bit more about it, like and subscribe. And I'm curious to know, have any of you actually been through the appraisal process? And if so, let us know in the comments. Tell us how your experience went. Was it positive? And was there anything that you wish you would have known going into it that you didn't know at the time? Thanks again for watching, and I will catch you next week where I provide more tips on how to get the most out of your insurance policy.